Yeah, so if the knowledge of the glory of the Lord is knowledge of his character, how is that gained? Now we can see from creation some of his character, his power and so on. It is in historical events then that you recognize more of his justice and mercy and compassion. So once you realize that God is responsible for this people only toiling for fire and so on, you've got a glimpse of the glory of God, an aspect of the glory of God. And here particularly once you see that the Babylonians are doing this without getting real reward in the end, then you know God is just. He's not allowing them to get away with that plundering they're doing. Their toil will ultimately produce nothing for them. But it is a first that of course then it can be allowed to grow further, and today we ask, how do people know the glory of the Lord? Then surely they will need to know about Christ. That's where we see the glory of God supremely. But the earth being filled with the knowledge of the glory of the God, with the waters covering the sea, perhaps it's even more comprehensive than what we can get at this moment. And so even knowing what we do about the glory of God, knowing so much more than Habakkuk knew, and because we're looking back to the cross and the resurrection and the wonderful things that he does, which Habakkuk could at best sort of glimpse that there's something like this going on. But we know how it happened, what happened, and the consequences of it. Even so, there's a great deal in the world that doesn't make sense to us. And if everything is under God's sovereignty, as we believe, and as the scriptures testify, at some point we would love to know how all these different things relate to God, sovereignty, and what they say about God. And so I think for us there's still a big gap where I want more knowledge of the glory of the Lord than I have at the moment. And I think this knowledge will involve, I hope it will involve some understanding of why certain things happened the way they happened in this world, why there's a war here, why there's famine there, and how does it all fit together into God's larger overarching purposes. So the knowledge of the glory of the Lord is here closely related to historical events. And so I expect that knowing the character of God relates to knowing more about how his sovereignty and his love and his purposes plan out in allowing some countries to be close to the gospel pretty much for such a long time, and so on. So, yeah. So another heading, a prayer of the prophet Habakkuk. And then I've translated besides vehement protests, which you won't find anywhere else. Many translations just have Shigionoth, even transliterate the Hebrew. I think one thing that I can say about my commentary, if I can say nothing else, that there is no commentary that has written more in chapter 3, verse 1 than mine. I'm sure. I've studied this in some detail. What does this last phrase mean? And it's usually understood to refer to some sort of musical thing, a tune maybe, or something. But the interesting thing is that in medieval times, that's not how it was understood ever. It was understood as related to the Hebrew word for error, a prayer of the prophet Habakkuk concerning errors, concerning mistakes, even sins. And I think some have gone as far as to read chapter 3 as Habakkuk's confession of sin. saying that the way he prayed before, like Job's complaint, Job at the end says, well, okay, I didn't really understand, not even half of it, of what was going on. And we see Job repenting in dust and ashes, or however you translate this, because that's also quite a difficult one, what's happening with Job at the end of the book. But he comes to see God in a new light, in a way that in some sense invalidates what he had said before. And throughout, I think, Christian and Jewish medieval tradition, there was a strong reading of Habakkuk 3 as saying, actually, maybe I shouldn't have prayed like that, like chapter 1. I think that's going a bit too far. I don't see that this is really a confession of sin. But I do agree with those medieval commentators that this is a thematic thing, not a musical thing. The musical notation comes at the end, right at the end for the leader with string music. And if Al-Shigyonot were to do with music, I would expect it to be there at the end. And I sort of analyze the way in the Psalms, the genre of the composition and musical information and historical information, how they are arranged, how that typically works, to compare it with Habakkuk. And compare it a bit with Psalm 7, because Psalm 7 has a similar phrase, Shigayon, singular. Anyway, it's quite a complex discussion, but it leads me to translate tentatively in this besides, translate the preposition as besides, and interpret the noun as vehement protests. So those vehement protests refer to Habakkuk 1. We know from the how long must I shout out that it's not a one-off prayer. He's protesting God over and over again. But what's happening here is that he does stop protesting. This is the hush before him, all the earth. He stops the complaining. And that's why I'm also a bit more skeptical of the very modern evangelical tradition of taking Habakkuk 1 as an example of teaching us how to pray. I don't think the book of Habakkuk says that the prayer in Habakkuk 1 is wrong, but it doesn't recommend that prayer. The prayer that's recommended is this prayer. And we know that from the end of the book, for the leader, with string music. You give this poem to the musical leader because it's used in the congregation. It's not just Habakkuk's prayer. So it begins as the prayer of Habakkuk, but it becomes the prayer of the congregation, of the community. Habakkuk 1, we don't have any indication that, let's use this as a worship song or whatever, or complaint song. So I think there's a sense in which this complaint, and maybe it's true for general complaints, the Psalms clearly tell us that it's okay to complain before God. If that's the place where you're in, if that's in your heart, that's okay to pray like that. God can take it. He's a big boy. I mean, the expression. He can take any complaint. If it's an honest complaint that seeks to draw closer to God, rather than a sort of complaint that distances you from God, a bit like questions. When people have questions about the Christian faith, you usually quite quickly see whether they are asking questions because they're really interested and want to find out more and want to explore and see whether they take that step, or whether they're just putting questions in your way because they don't really want to engage. Or what about all the suffering in the world? What about those who've never heard about the gospel? And sometimes those questions are simply a way of keeping God and Christianity at an arm's length. They're not really interested in those questions. Those questions are just a way of saying, I can't believe this. In the same way, complaint can be just moaning and keeping God. I can't engage with God. He allows all this suffering and so on. That sort of complaint, that's a bad complaint. A good complaint is one where you bring things to God and you say, God, these are your responsibility. I want you to do something about it. And you try and keep engaging with God, and that's good and that's fine. But ideally, there comes a point when you stop complaining. You come to the hush before him, all the earth, and you come to a prayer more like this prayer. A prayer of the prophet Habakkuk, therefore, set besides those vehement protests. So those vehement protests, they are not deleted. We get the book of Habakkuk with this complaint. They're not cancelled, they're there. But alongside these protests, we now put a different prayer. Because this is not a complaint prayer. So while maybe in the Christian church we have more often the opposite problem, people argue that we've got difficulties with complaint. The Psalms are full of complaint as well as praise. Our church music tends to be full of praise and struggle with complaint. We don't find so easy ways of lamenting, complaining before God. I think there's an element of truth in that. There's a very famous essay by one of the leading, less conservative, but still very interesting scholars, Walter Brueggemann, The Costly Loss of Lament. And he has a reflection on what happens in the church when we lose the lament, when we don't use those complaint psalms. And he knows how the dangers involved with that we always happy, clappy, and so on, and we don't take injustice and suffering as seriously as we should. And it inhibits our ability to stand alongside people suffering if we're all very quick in praising and don't know how to complain. But someone else, I think it was Mark Boda, a few years later wrote an essay in response to it, which he titled The Priceless Gain of Penitence, in which he points out, because he's done a lot of research in the later literature of the New Testament, and in fact in this commentary series he's written the commentary on Zechariah, and he says what we have after the Siege of Jerusalem is quite a lot of more penitential prayer. We have Nehemiah 9, we have Daniel 9, and so on. And he says that the reason why there's less complaint is that the complaint is turned back on us, and there's penitence. So there is maybe also a reason why within the church we have more of a confession of sin, an act of penitence in liturgical churches that would pretty much always be a part of a Sunday service at least, and in a historical Church of England service it would be part of every morning and evening prayer, an act of penitence. So even more than in the book of the Psalms, where you do get Psalm 51 of course and so on, you do get Psalms of penitence, but not as many. And by contrast, in the church you get many more acts of penitence and fewer complaints. And there may be a good reason for that as well. So I want to hold this sort of intention, I suppose, saying that, yes, there may be, we need to ask ourselves whether we are honest with God and whether we are taking injustice and evil seriously enough and are prepared to complain to God about it, and see whether we need more hymns and songs along those lines. There's one I can't remember now whether it's Stuart Townend or Graham Kendrick lament that focuses on the many abortions and so on and the kill. It's one of the few laments that makes it in our hymn book, I think. So that we need to ask that question, but we shouldn't beat up ourselves about not complaining enough, because it is good to move from that confrontational place to a place of penitence and praise and submission to God. And in fact, even in the Psalms, there are what is called the lament Psalms. You had some Psalms, didn't you, already? So you probably know that there are two different categories of those lament Psalms. Basically those where someone prays assuming that God is on his side, and others that are the full-blown complaint psalms that assume that God is the enemy, that he's got an issue with God. And they are not actually all as common. The lament psalms is the biggest genre in the Psalter, but only a part of it is direct, why God have you forsaken us? That sort of address, that is a protest against God. So here, Habakkuk did engage in that protest. How long, why, is what we find in the Psalms as well. But here he now adds a prayer besides that, alongside that. And it teaches us to move in this direction. And I think with the super subscript, strictly speaking, at the end of the poem, this is the one we're meant to move towards. This is the one that's meant for congregational use. And so one important reflection that we can have just looking at chapter 3, verse 1, is to recognize the importance of prayer. In Habakkuk, it is most noteworthy. Jeremiah does a fair bit of praying as well in the book of Jeremiah. But it seems to be assumed that prophecy and prayer goes together. I've said this a few times now in the session, so it goes together. In James, I think it's James, when he refers to Elijah, he says Elijah prayed and it didn't rain. I think, how do you know that? It never says in 1 Kings that Elijah prayed that it wouldn't rain. He just announces it won't rain. How do you know he prayed for it? I think James says we can assume that. All prophets pray first before they preach. So he will have prayed for this before he preached it. And of course, I assume that we do that. We pray before we preach, hopefully. But Habakkuk is a particularly powerful reminder, I think, that of the need for the proclamation, the discerning this prophecy to arise out of prayer. The response to the complaint, but a deeper insight in some ways comes from that further reflective prayer that we have in chapter 3. I don't have many slides for chapter 3, but I have the kind of the body parts slides. Lord, I have heard the report about you. I am awed or alarmed. This is how it begins, with hearing. We ended the morning by looking at the motives of hearing and seeing. So we have seeing. Verse 7, under affliction I see, or in place of iniquity I see. So we've got a hearing and a seeing together. And we've got, in this poem, a bit more. I have heard, and my belly trembles. At a sound, my lips quivered. Decay entered my bones. At my foots, I tremble. So there's a whole going through the body, belly, lips, bones, foot, and so on. So it's a very physical experience here for him, this prayer. So it does seem to have been a prayer of great emotion and of great experience, possibly some sort of mystic experience. We're not told, so we need to speculate if we want to try and imagine the scene. But many have wondered whether Habakkuk prayed this and received some revelation in a temple and had some mystical experience, because there's a lot going on with his body and there's a lot of formal revelation entering him. And as we see here, just from those references, I am awed or I'm alarmed. Affliction, I see. My belly trembles, my lips quiver. This is not, now everything is fine. Oh, I know the Babylonians will finally be defeated, so yeah, that's okay then. Let's praise God. The end will come. And it's not like that at all yet. This prayer is still a prayer with a lot of anguish, And the situation, of course, hasn't changed yet. I've heard a report about you, and it's not perfectly clear what this refers to, whether this is back to chapter 2 or whether it's looking forward to what we read in a moment. But if you take it back to chapter 2, so I've heard this and I'm alarmed. I'm not comforted, he says. I'm alarmed. He may be also comforted, but he puts the focus on, wow, this is big. And this probably means there's a whole lot more suffering to come before it will end. So it's good news in a way, but maybe a bit like Jeremiah's news to the exiles. Yeah, you will return in 40 years. Yeah, but I think about it, that means I won't return, my children will. So there may be quite a bit more to come. Lord, your work in the midst of years, renew it. So this is an expression of confidence now. I think the phrase your work is quite significant in Habakkuk. We remember in verse 5, to say it a bit differently, one is about to do a deed in your days. This is a work of God. The Nebuchadnezzar coming. And then this my argument that originally in chapter 2, verse 4, refer to God's work as well, that God's work is just. If so, we may have a consistent theme running through. But while in chapter 1 he complains about God's work, now he says, your work, renew it. Keep going with it. So there's an expression of trust. It's tough, but I know that in the end, your work is going to produce justice. And so, yes, keep going, renew your work. In the midst of years, I take that to mean that I'm finding myself in the midst of a long-term project. And I know that I'm not seen the end yet, and I'm in fact a long way from seeing where this is going to head. But I trust that it will end well, and so renew it. In the midst of years, you shall make it known. In turmoil, this is a key word in this chapter, picked up with the trembling later on in verse 7, so with different nuances, that word is used a few times. In turmoil, you shall remember to have compassion. Sometimes interpreted to refer to the turmoil within God. In other words, his wrath as another. And so in wrath, remember mercy. I think it's a very common translation. But I'm inclined to think that a turmoil is not on the part of God, but our general turmoil and agitation in the midst of all this suffering and turmoil. Remember to have compassion, because that is part of your nature. If you want to know the glory of the Lord, remember, glory of the Lord, Exodus 34, God is compassionate and merciful. If you're trying to be wise, discerning God's ways, then those ways must, in all the turmoil, there must be some compassion somewhere for that to be a reflection of the glory of God. So that's the opening prayer. And that, I think, frames the prayer and puts it in a context, because what comes in chapter 3 reads like a theophany, an appearance of God. There's a lot of debate. Is it looking back to a past experience or forward to a future experience? But all this is framed by verse 2. It's in the context of a petitionary prayer, renew your work. Because what follows in verse 3 is not a prayer in the literal sense of the word, like asking God for something. It's describing God's coming. But this description of God's coming, I think, is a way of saying, because it uses the language that alludes to his appearance in the past, renew your work, do it again, come again, like this. So the petition is for verses 3 following to be implemented. God, from Teman he comes. I'm going to try to reflect the slightly unusual Hebrew here. In fact, a slightly unusual word for God here. Eloah is the one that's used in the book of Job more often. From Teman he comes, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Where is Teman and Paran? Do you know? Yes, Teman is closer to the east, the Edomite territory. Yeah, so you're looking east, and it's one of the questions is, what's the perspective you should take as you observe God coming? From where do you observe God coming? And I think it looks like you might observe God coming from Egypt or Sinai region, because you're looking then eastwards, and God appears like a sunrise. So you're looking east, because you're seeing God rising like a bright light in verse 4. And from that region, and from Judea, the Teman and Mount Paran mountains, because they're quite high, it will be the place where you see the sun arising. So God comes from Teman. His majesty covers the heavens. So again, that's I think a literal image we are meant to have in mind, like the sun. When the sun rises behind high mountains, then you get a lot of light before you see the sun, because in a sense it has risen above the horizon a long time ago, but you don't see the sun because there are these high mountains. So first, it covers the heavens. There's a lot of light already before you see the sun. But then once the sun rises above the mountains, suddenly you have this flood of light, and I think that's reflected, and in the earth is full of his praiseworthiness. I try to translate this slightly unusual one. So the earth recognizes that God is praiseworthy as the light appears. And haze becomes like bright light. So what is at first only a hazy light becomes like broad daylight. This is in a sense the movement that Habakkuk wants. So when we see God using the Babylonians to punish Jerusalem, we see God's work in a haze, because we only see one important aspect of God. He will not leave the guilty unpunished, but we see a lot of violence and aggression that obscures God's character as well. We don't see the compassion so well, and so on. And that's why kind of what he expects and hopes for is that this haze in which we see glimpses of God's glory will become broad daylight, where everything will be clear and present, like the knowledge of the glory of God covering, like the waters cover the sea. It becomes all clear. Twin rays from his hand are his. I've talked with someone this week about the ambiguity of that Hebrew word. So the word for horn refers in English to the material of which a horn is made, but in Hebrew the word for horn refers to the shape of a horn, and it's a shape like a ray. And so you get some places in Israel as well, up in Galilee, near the Sea of Galilee, that are called a horn because of the horn shape of the mountain. And that's why you could either translate twin rays from his hand are his, or twin horns come forth. And I've put both here in the translation because you will at first, as a Hebrew reader, I think read rays, because there's all this image of sunlight, bright and so on. You think rays. So rays come from his hands, slightly surprising place, but it's from his power, from his activities, light arises. But then the next line, and there is the hiding place of his strength. Now strength and horn go together. a horn of my strength, and so on. So once you read that next line, you think, oh, yeah, those twin rays, maybe they are also twin horns. And that's, of course, the beauty of poetry. In poetry, you might expect something like that to happen, that you're not able to say, is it rays or is it horns? In prose, you usually should be able to say, that's it. The other is wrong. This is right, this is wrong. Except for some jokes or so on with the play and so on. But normally in prose, you just settle on one thing. But in poetry, that is part of what poetry sometimes does, is you first think of one thing, and by the way, this is also true. The light, the greater knowledge of God's character involves a knowledge of his true strength, a horn of his strength, and so you translate horns as well. Yeah, yes, I think we can relate that to each other. So there's poetic lines. As you know, parallelism is often with little development, but parallelism also sometimes does have a narrative development, so that the second line happens later than the first line. And I think that's what's happening here. The Majesty first covers the heavens, and then the earth is full of his praiseworthiness. And in the same way, 2:14, so theologically you might say, God's majesty always covers the heavens. In the heavenly realm, there's no question about God's character. The angels have a pretty clear idea about God's character. It's here on earth that we struggle to see that implemented. And so that's why we pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So in heaven, God's will is already done. In earth, well, we still pray for it to be done. So it moves from heaven to earth. And so 2:14 is looking to that future moment when the knowledge of the glory of the Lord that's already available in the heavenlies will be filling the earth as well. And so I think you could say this relates to the same thing, because once all the earth is filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, what do you get? Well, you get, hopefully, you must get praise of God. Once you really understand God's character, you cannot but praise him for it. So the praiseworthiness here would be a natural response to the earth being filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. This is one reason why this chapter is incredibly difficult, because the poet does something for us very peculiar with the verb forms he uses. So peculiar that you could go in any one direction. So it's a big question, should you translate present tense or past tense or future tense? And so some people will translate, God has come from Teman. That's, I think, quite a regular translation to refer back to the future. Some will say, God will come. And I use the present tense, he comes, and therefore the earth is full of his praiseworthiness in this context. Because I see that as Habakkuk expressing something, in a sense, he sees. So in the vision, in his prayer experience, it is present tense. God comes. But that doesn't tell us yet whether what he sees at this moment is something that tells a story about what happened in the past, so that he's reflecting back on how God first came, because that's a prominent interpretation with the reference to Cushan and Midian and so on, that this is referring back to the Exodus. That Habakkuk is remembering how God came from the east, Teman, Mount Paran, going west to Egypt, taking his people, and then going back and bringing them into the land. And it's present tense because he sees this at a moment, he kind of sees the film that tells a story of what happened in the past. I think rather that he sees something that is going to happen. So it's present tense because he sees the film at this moment, but the film is kind of science fiction film, a film that speaks of something that's going to happen in the future, but in language it relates to what happened in the past. Because it makes the point that God is consistent in his character. How do I know what God is going to do in the future? Well, I can look at his promises, and I can look at what he's done in the past, because he will not contradict what he's done in the past. So I think those scholars who think that there are lots of allusions to the Exodus and the conquest of the land are perfectly right. Habakkuk remembers that God led Israel out of Egypt and he brought them into the land, and that was an amazing revelation of his character. His judgment over Egypt with the darkness, his compassion for Israel, his judgment over Israel as well in the wilderness, but his compassion in leading them into the land, his graciousness and favor, so that the earth, or at least the land, that region here, in a sense was filled with his praiseworthiness at this moment already in the past. Not the whole earth, because not everyone knew about it, but quite a few people in the region knew about what God had done, as Rahab says to the spies, and we've heard God has done, and they were in awe of it. So there was a bit of a fulfillment of that. He remembers that, and as he said in chapter 1, "Are you not from of old, O Lord?" It's not simply saying, you're a pretty ancient God, aren't you? But you are from of old in our relationship as well. And he even personalizes it by using the first person, "My God, my Holy One, we should not die." We're going back a long time, and here he's remembering that long time. Surely you've brought your people out of Egypt and gave them the land for a purpose, and that purpose cannot be to be completely destroyed by the Babylonians now. So he's looking back in that sense, but he knows that at the moment, where we are at the moment, feels more like oppression under Egypt. We're not literally slaves of the Pharaoh, but we're slaves of Nebuchadnezzar. It's a bit like being in Egypt again. So I'm looking for another Exodus. I'm looking for God doing that again. And then in the future, the earth will again be filled with the praiseworthiness of God. So a very long answer to the short point is that when it says the earth is full of his praiseworthiness, when it uses when I use in my translation anyway, the present tense, that's not necessarily a claim that this is happening here and now, but that in Habakkuk's prayer, it is already happening. And in some sense, it has happened in the past already, and in a greater sense, it's going to happen in the future. But this promise in chapter 2, verse 14, "The earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord," has not been fulfilled yet in chapter 3, as Habakkuk is praying. Yes, definitely. And I think there's a lot of typology going on in the Old Testament itself already, as you would expect, because you can't have typology in the New Testament just like that out of the blue. The people of God need to learn how typology works before they can apply it to seeing Christ. And so Nahum was preserved because Nineveh is a type of evil and could be reapplied to Babylon, could be reapplied to Rome, and then to Satan and his hoarders in the end. And Isaiah, of course, in the second part, speaks of, in a sense, of a second Exodus. So you've got the Exodus typology elsewhere as well. Habakkuk here doesn't speak of going out. He doesn't use very explicit Exodus language. But I think with most scholars that the allusions are strong enough here to think that he is thinking of the Exodus and wants to see that again. He probably doesn't use the kind of literal Exodus language in the way that the second part of Isaiah does, because it doesn't make so much sense in praying in Judah, possibly in the Temple of Jerusalem. It makes sense in praying in Babylon, in the for the exile, because the second part of Isaiah addresses the exiles, because they are literally outside the land and literally need to be taken out, delivered from their slavery to be brought back into the land. Habakkuk and his people, they are not outside the land, so they don't need an exodus to be led from slavery in a foreign land to back. But they are in a similar situation. They are enslaved under oppression and violence from a foreign power, so they need a kind of exodus experience. But it's not a going out that's the key thing, and that's probably why Habakkuk doesn't use that language of going out and going up in the land so clearly. Oh yes, good. I forgot about it. Yes, yes it is, except for verse 13. So in other words, Habakkuk 3 is the only place where we have the Selah. And Habakkuk 3 is also the only place where we have at the end for the leader with string music, which is a typical psalm thing. Although in the Psalms, most of us think it's a superscription, isn't it? In all our translations, it's a superscription. There are actually some people who argue, and I think Bruce Waltke is one of them who's persuaded by that, who think that these are not superscriptions. They're actually misplaced, that they belong to the preceding psalm. So what we think of as the superscription of, say, Psalm 14 actually is the subscript of Psalm 13. And the person, James Tittle, I think, who first developed that argument, appealed in part to Habakkuk 3. You see, in Habakkuk 3, we see that these musical instructions come at the end of the poem. And he argues that the same is true in the Psalms, so that they belong to the preceding psalm. But never mind. Anyways, it's a different story. And if I say I haven't been persuaded, that's probably too strong putting it, in the sense that I have looked at the argument, but I'm so wedded to the tradition that I really struggle to think of it as subscripts rather than superscriptions in the Psalms. But I know this is, after decades of reading it one way, it's just very hard to do. So the argument relates to how it fits better with the content, often with the preceding psalm, and so on. So this is a unique composition, Habakkuk 3, in that it is like you could find it in the book of Psalms with the Selah and with the strings and music and so on. But Habakkuk 3 is also one of the chapters, not the only one like that ends up in hymn books elsewhere. So there are early Christian collections, and I think some might go back to Jewish collections of canticles, little songs like psalms that are not in the Psalms, and they would include probably the Song of Hannah in Samuel and Habakkuk 3. But none of those other ones, the Song of Hannah or in the New Testament, the Benedictus and the Magnificat, none of them use Selah, so that is unique. And in short, we don't really know what it means. But I think my reading is that it is a sign of a musical interlude. So that at this point, there's a bit of music before you go on singing, chanting the next verse. And that usually means that you are meant to ponder on something before you move on to the next. So God, from Teman he comes, the Holy One from Mount Paran. Let's have a bit of string music while we reflect on that. What does it mean for God to come from Teman? And then the things happen. His majesty covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praiseworthiness. So in reading it out in public, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense to read the Selah. I would probably just leave a pause here if I read it out in public. Just leave a slightly longer pause here. He's coming, but he's not coming on his own. He's got companions. And I've translated it maybe over literally, before his face, because that standard phrase, before his face, is used in Hebrew just for before. So the element of face is often lost. But here I think it is significant because we have the face at the beginning of the verse and we have the feet at the end of the verse. And surrounded by his face and feet, sort of embodied in what he's doing, goes pestilence and burning plague. And I've put them in capital to acknowledge that they are personified here, although not as deities necessarily. Although the word pestilence, I think, is the one that is also used for a deity. Reshef is a deity in the ancient world, and some people read this as God coming with these minor deities around. And that is possible. It doesn't need to compromise our monotheism, because the Bible testifies that there's only one who really deserves the term God, because there's only one who created everything. There's one creator and everything else is created. But among the things created and the beings that are created are some supernatural beings, which we tend to call angels and demons. But in the ancient world, they would be more often called deities as well. And sometimes in the Bible as well, God is portrayed as in the council of the gods. So there are others that are called gods in the Bible. They are not God in the full sense of the word, because they're created beings. But they are gods in the sense of being supernatural beings of quite some power, and having access to God and being in his divine counsel. Because God just loves doing things in community with others. And so he engages us on the earth primarily. He's given the earth to humanity to reign, but he also works with angels. And so it is not in principle, well, there could be deities called pestilence and burning plague that work with him. You know, why not? But there is only evidence for the name of a deity for one of those two and not for the other. So I think there's probably not much left of a sense of deity, but more of personifying pestilence and burning plague. Which of course means there's disaster coming. This has been a complaint from the start of Habakkuk. Pestilence and burning plague, that doesn't sound great. There's bad things coming. The change from chapter 1 is that pestilence and burning plague are now poetically enclosed between God's face and his feet. And so there's maybe a greater sense of, yes, they will serve his purpose and they are under his control. While Habakkuk 1 seems to be wondering, God, are you still awake, checking this out, looking at it? Or have you completely given it over to Nebuchadnezzar to do as he wishes? Here, pestilence and burning plague are clearly servants at his feet, before his face, using those phrases that are used for people that go before a dignitary or that serve them at their feet. They're clearly subordinate servants. And so we go back to the he of God himself and to a number of very clever word plays. And the fact that I've translated one way and then put something else in brackets is meant to indicate that I believe that these are deliberate and that we are meant to read both, not decide between one. And in this order, he stands and surveys a land. So he looks, surveys the land, and his surveying the land shakes the land, because his coming is terrifying. So when we see him surveying the land, then it's shaking the land. He looks and spies out, and this startles the nations. He startles nations. And the everlasting hills are shattered. The eternal hills bow down. So the hills and the mountains are a symbol in the Old Testament for something that endures forever. Who's going to move a mountain? No one, until Jesus says, pray, you move the mountain. But there's a symbol for something that will just not change. Villages come and go, and forests burn down and regrow and so on, but mountains, they're just there and big and unmovable. And so to say that something is really dramatically shattering, turning everything upside down, is to say the everlasting hills are shattered. The eternal hills bow down in worship as God approaches. The ancient triumphal procession belongs to him. Verse 7, under affliction or in place of iniquity, I see, it's a difficult one to translate. But I've gone in place of iniquity here because he's trembling, he's shaking. The trembling picks up the word of turmoil. And what he's seen before is iniquity. I see iniquity and I don't see God doing anything about it. But instead of iniquity and in the place where there's iniquity, what I now see is the tents of Cushan trembling. The 10 curtains of the land of Midian. So poetically, this doesn't work so well in English. I'm really mutilating English nearly. But the verb is meant to go with both lines. And that's why it's arranged like that. The tents of Cushan, trembling. Trembling, the 10 curtains of the land of Midian. Cushan, there is, as you might expect, a bit of a debate. Is that Cush with an unusual extra ending attached to it? That would be slightly peculiar because it's in a quite different region from Midian. Or is there another Cush? We talked about the Cush of Nimrod, and then there's the Cush south of Egypt. Is there a third one near Midian? Because Moses had a Midianite wife, and Moses had a Cushite wife. Are they the same? If they are the same, then maybe that is a Cushan, a different Cushan that's in Midian, or maybe he had two wives, first a Cushite wife and a Midianite wife. So there's a lot of debate about this, and I would need to look up my commentary to remember what I think about it. But whichever region it precisely refers to, I think what he says he sees here is God is coming, and the kind of people that Israel went through on the way to the promised land are trembling. And so that's probably a hopeful element as well. It's all still pretty frightening with pestilence and plague coming and so on, but he is spying out a land. He's startling nations, and they are already afraid of his coming. Maybe God has a plan here of doing something big. Verse 8, I could say that really about any verse here, but it's another one. It's a big debate of interpretation. Literally, is it against streams that it burns, the Lord, O Lord? Indeed, against the streams, your anger, against the sea, your fury, when you mount your horses, your chariots of deliverance. It's a rhetorical question, and if you phrase it like this, the answer must be no. And a large number of commentators and translators are convinced that the answer should be yes. And therefore, they translate differently. Is it not against streams? Some add the symbol not to it that isn't there in the text. And so some people are really keen to have the answer, because you'd expect the answer to be yes. God's anger is against these watery forces that threaten God's people. But surprisingly, in Habakkuk's poem, the answer seems to be no, there's more going on. Is it against streams that it burns? Indeed, against the streams, your anger. There are, to remind myself, I should have a look at a Hebrew text here. Just escape this. the forms that he uses here for streams are unusual. I'm just trying to check and remember what it's both. It's not both times. I think it's one. It's the normal plural form and the unusual. Oh, that's why I couldn't see it. It's over there on the extended screen. Habakkuk 3:8. Neharim. So he uses the standard. Is it against rivers, O Lord, that your anger against rivers? The same word used again. Is it against the sea that your anger is? No. Yeah, that makes sense. We have just a standard word for rivers. God is not coming against the rivers when he is not even coming against the sea. When he mounts his horses and chariots of deliverance, when he gets ready to fight. So, who is he going against then? Well, we're not told yet. We need to find out. So we're held in suspense. Clearly, we should have got a sense in verses 3 to 7 that God is coming in anger. Yeah, he wouldn't be coming with pestilence and burning plague if it wasn't in anger. So the question is, who's going to be the object of that anger? Is it going to be us or the Babylonians or what? The rivers, the streams, the force of chaos? Well, the answer comes following on from verse 9. Fully uncovered is your bow. So they had a protective covering over the bow. When that is removed, you know, okay, someone is getting ready for action. Well, there, I don't know what you find in ESV. There you probably find different translation. In many of those verses, if you compare different translations, you get all sorts of different things happening. But in my translation, oaths are the rods, a word. I go with something that has the advantage of being very literal and the disadvantage of not making an immediate lot of sense as a result. So the rods with which the enemy is beaten up, what do they consist of? Oaths. So God has made an oath that he's going to do it, and it's his word that is the power, a word that he's spoken that will come to pass. That is his weapon. And it's such a complicated verse that it's just as well we have a Selah here and have a bit of musical interlude to figure out what is going on there.